Thank you. Well, thanks very much, and thanks a lot, both Peter and Nicole, for inviting me up here. It's terrific to have 24 hours up in Sydney, away from the humdrum of my daily existence down at RMIT. I'm going to focus on planning for new suburbs in greenfield areas. And what I'm attempting to do is to draw on several bits of seemingly unrelated research that I've done and pull together the points they have in common and make some, conclusions, draw out some conclusions about the way that we plan for new suburbs. I'm attempting, as I say, to synthesise a lot of the work I've done. A lot of it has been in Melbourne, so unfortunately some of the references will be Melbourne centric, but I've also done some work that looks at master planned estates in Sydney, and also the work Nicole referred to about retail planning brings in Brisbane. Greenfield suburbs are probably, the scale of the issue is probably bigger in Melbourne because we have such a large proportion of new housing goes into the greenfield suburbs on the urban sprawl, much greater proportion than is the case up here in Sydney. But nevertheless, I think the issues are still relevant, and so you can hopefully draw your own conclusions about that. So first I want you to, I'm going to draw you a picture, partly because this is based on an article that I've lost, a cutting that I had from the newspaper. It was an article a couple of years ago in the Melbourne Fairfax paper, The Age, which had a photo of a recently arrived Sudanese woman standing at her front gate with several small children around her, and she was looking out into the street. And somewhere in the article she was quoted as saying, "There is nothing here." And the article was really about the lack of transportation in the suburb that she was in, the lack of public transport. And she was talking about the lack of things to walk to, the lack of services and facilities and places to go to. You'll just have to imagine the picture, I'm afraid, because, as I say, I couldn't find it when I tried to look on the Age website. Melbourne's western suburbs are flat. The city has quite different geomorphology on both sides. So the flat western plains, they're basalt plains, lots of grasslands, and often what looks like empty paddocks with Scotch thistles. In fact, we now know that a lot of these are precious endangered grasslands, and one of my colleagues says that there are more endangered species in Melbourne's western suburbs than in Kakadu National Park, which sounds impressive, but then I guess you think, well, if it's in a national park, it's probably not endangered for that reason. But we also know that there are little critters like the legless lizard and the growling grass frog, which are now prized and endangered there. But all that richness is probably not apparent to a newly arrived refugee who's just looking for a bus stop and some shops. So why should we focus on new suburbs? Well, it's often where the most affordable housing is. Many people are now concerned about the growing disparities between inner and outer areas in our big cities. And really property prices reflect the market demand and reflect the fact that there is so much more that people now value about living in the inner and middle suburbs compared with the outer suburbs. One reason I think to focus on it is that planners actually have a much greater role in planning for new suburbs, starting from scratch. In existing suburbs, it is essentially reactive. You're waiting for somebody to propose something, and then you can decide whether it's a good idea or not, whether it fits with the plan. So obviously when you're starting a new suburb from scratch, you've got a lot more potential to do good and to alter things. This is where I may sound a little critical of some of these new suburbs, but really often now there is a complete lack of variety of urban form. There's a lack of activities. There's certainly a lack of public transport in a lot of the outer suburbs, and of course a lack of employment. So many people that live in the outer suburbs have to travel long distances to get to jobs. There are basically houses and shopping malls, and I'm going to talk about shopping malls in a little bit. There are, of course, some schools and some services, but often not enough. And certainly in Melbourne, there's always really campaigns on, particularly around schools, getting schools into these areas. Not all outer suburbs are grim, but it does go a bit with the affluence of the suburb and the amount of money being spent on it. Some of the best planned places now are the master planned estates, which are popping up all over the place with increasing degrees of exclusion. And I'll talk about that too in a minute. Older suburbs, of course, have an unfair advantage, and this is something that I often remind students of when we take them to walk around, that just the practice of things being altered and ageing and having years and years of investment, both public investment and also private investment, makes them inevitably much richer. There is much more detail and fine grain in older suburbs. And again, property prices reflect this. But partly that range of facilities and services and jobs partly comes by just having more people with greater density. I was at a national urban conference last week, and there was a lot of debate about whether you should be attempting to put jobs in the outer suburbs, bringing the jobs to the people, or getting better transport so that people are able to access the jobs. It doesn't seem very tricky to say that actually we should be trying to do both. Most of these things are false dichotomies. Why not try and fix up as much as you can? But I think it's true that a lot of the services, and certainly with public transport, delay coming to new suburbs. It's often on the basis that there aren't enough people there yet. So why don't we try and build new suburbs with greater densities from the start? A couple of years ago, when we were doing some interviews with both planners and developers, we asked them that sort of question. Why are they so intent on building single houses on single blocks? And basically it's because they don't think there's a market for medium density in the outer suburbs. And they're naturally not prepared to build things that are not going to sell. And of course they could be right. Because what people are doing in living in smaller places in the inner and middle ring is trading off private space for public goods and services. And if there aren't public goods and services around, why would you? One of the things that we discovered also in doing these interviews was what I think is quite a worrying tendency for developers actually attempting to guarantee the single house on the single lot by placing legal covenants over new housing estates. One of the outer western suburbs that we went to in Melbourne had just done a small research project on this because their planners were concerned about it, and they estimated that up to 90% of their new housing was now covered by single lot covenants. They thought that this was really an attempt in... The outer west of Melbourne is a little bit like the outer west of Sydney, I think, demographically. It's generally a cheaper, less affluent area. And it was an attempt to provide a sort of quality assurance that if you move in here, it'll always look as good as it does from when we first built it. It's a kind of no change covenant. The planners, I might say, were reading more into it than that. And suggesting that there were overtones of exclusion and even racism, because it's an area of high migrant immigration. We have seen an increase in master planned estates, and as Nicole mentioned, I've done quite a bit of work over the years on master planned estates with privatised assets. And they probably fall into two categories. Firstly, the non-essential things like swimming pools and gyms and golf courses, and in some cases marinas, which are just used as additional selling points. So it's to create that sense of resort lifestyle. That we did a whole project on this that looked at the way they were promoted, and which was quite fun. But I don't have time to go into it, but it was quite fun looking at the image of life that they were promoting. So that's all non-essential, but increasingly essential infrastructure is being placed in private ownership too, which includes roads. And I think there are a lot of reasons for concern about that. The reasons for putting roads in is often not the same. It's not about, I would argue anyway, it's not about an advertising thing, because I'm not sure that that's necessarily that attractive, but it's often that they're being built to a narrower size and a lower standard, and they're cheaper to build than what the council would require. That has implications for public transport, because they're often too narrow, so you'd never get a bus in there, should you be lucky enough to ever attract a bus service. Now, these privatised assets have to be held by an owners association, as their community associations, they're called in New South Wales. Owners corporations in Victoria, they used to be called bodies corporate. Homeowners associations in America. These bodies that every person who buys into the estate becomes a member of has to pay annual fees towards and take part in the governance. So when an estate starts off, the developer actually owns all these things, and they sell their shares with the properties they're selling. So they end up exiting, and the group of residents owns these things collectively. There are a lot of issues with this, and I'll touch on just a few. The legal structures, of course, mean annual fees. One of the things I think that's tricky about this is that roads are very, very expensive to redo, should they require redoing. And I think because this is relatively early days, perhaps the fees are not taking into account how much they could cost. But having private assets necessarily means you need to restrict the use of them, particularly with the things like the swimming pool and recreation areas. So they'll have some sort of barrier to stop people that don't live on the estate using them. Often have signage too. We've done quite a bit of work about conflicts that arise because of these sort of structures. We started doing this because one of my colleagues actually lived in one and was able to report firsthand on some of the conflict that was going on. But things like, after a time, people saying, why should I keep having to pay these fees when I don't use the swimming pool, the gym, the marina, whatever? It's not big enough anyway, because of course it was built when there were only a few houses, and as the estate expands often it isn't big enough. And then issues like, who let those drunk people in the swimming pool and whose friends are they anyway? So there's lots of conflicts because people basically can't opt out. They have to stay part of this association. They have to keep contributing their fees. As I said before, I think there are concerns about how much money is set aside for potential problems, so that things that start off looking like luxury assets might end up being actually deteriorating liabilities. We also found that people are often not aware and don't understand their obligations, and there's lots of research on this, not only here in Australia but in England and New Zealand and the United States. But probably for the purposes of tonight's talk, what I'm really concerned about is the separation, that these are isolated pockets of residential development, not connected to the areas, the local municipalities that they're in. And providing these private assets means that people don't engage. They don't go to the public swimming pool. They don't use the public park because they have their own. In one case that I know of, residents in the estate have actually got a rate reduction. So they're in quite a poor municipality and they're actually paying less rates than the people outside the estate on the basis that they're maintaining their own parks and gardens. So they've got exemption from paying the portion of their rates that goes for parks and gardens. And I think that's a very worrying trend. And as I said before, often roads, for example, are not constructed to the same standard. Some very recent work, so recent that it's not yet published, so this is a forthcoming article, has done a count of the new community associations, community title residential developments in Sydney, and came up with a total of 246 residential developments in the last 20 years that had private, some form of privately owned asset. These are residential ones. There was about 300 in total, but 50 or so were commercial. More than half of the developments that had privately provided essential infrastructure, so things like roads as well as, and even electricity, as well as the kind of non-essential things. Mostly, these estates are mostly low density, the sort of single house on a single lot that I talked about. But because they're sort of planned in isolation, what you're getting is a very patchwork form of residential development. And I would argue it's really increasing the divide between the people inside the estate and those on the outside. So I think that's an issue. And particularly when you look at the map, which I'll show you, shows a strong concentration of these in the outer western suburbs, particularly the northwest. And that may be a deliberate strategy to try and make those estates appear much more upmarket than the surrounding areas. So this will be much more familiar to most of you than it is to me, but you can see the areas with the largest numbers are out here in the outer west. So this is probably the first really comprehensive counting of these estates. These places will be very hard to change, and what I was saying earlier is that one of the reasons why older suburbs are appealing is, in fact, they've had this continual evolutionary process. So making these places effectively privatised, planning-free zones, they have their own internal planning and their own set of rules about house form and style. One of the most common conflicts is in homeowners associations is about people breaching the guidelines, having the wrong colour roof tiles, for example, or putting a non-permitted type of front fence. So they have their own kind of internal guidelines and internal planning, but from a metropolitan perspective, from a public planning perspective, they're really kind of out of bounds. As I say, the older suburbs are able to reflect changes in the community, and one of the things that I think is really important is being able to reflect when new groups come in and arrive into an area, particularly immigrant groups, and they are able to open up shops and cafes and the like. And when you go to such a place, you can see who's living there, whereas in these outer suburbs, it's very hard to tell. And it's not that immigrant groups aren't going into the outer areas. It's just that it's very hard to see them. As I've said earlier, in the new suburbs, mainly what we're building is houses and then shopping malls. So the shopping malls are quite a contrast to the very traditional street form. Somewhat indulgently, I've included some photos I took from Google of the suburb I grew up in Melbourne, which is very much dominated by the Greek community and still is. Most of the shops have Greek names. The traditional shopping form, and Melbourne has a large number of these, were either strip along main roads, and particularly having trams meant that sort of development developed that way because of the trams, or nodes around a train station. Critically, the premises, the shops are individually owned and managed. Now that's not to say that somebody can't come along and buy up lots of shops, but it's not corporately controlled. So you have a variety of sizes and ages and conditions of buildings and shop fronts, and that's really important because it means there are some cheap premises. So if you want to start up a business, you can find somewhere to rent to start your business that you're able to afford. This is one of my favourite little things from Melbourne's first ever metropolitan plan, which is the 1954 planning scheme. This is where they first identified the problem with shopping as they saw it with traditional shopping streets. You can see what they think the problem is, you know, that these housewives on whom falls most of the burden of shopping are clearly haven't got shopping trolleys and carrying lots of children and lots of shopping. And the one on the right's about to hop on a bus. Clearly what they need is a motor car. And clearly what they need is a form of shopping that goes with the motor car. So the 54 plan had two examples from America of what would be desirable to bring to Melbourne. And in fact, worked with the Meyer family to make sure it happened some few years later. So shopping malls came to Australia. The very first one was Chermside in Brisbane in 1957. And then I think the second one was Chadstone Shopping Centre in Melbourne in 1960. So the big difference is that they're built and operated as one entity. Tenancies are controlled for low investment risk. So generally with a shopping mall, the management will work out what sort of shops they want to go where. You've all seen them, they're all built very similarly with a supermarket down one end, probably another supermarket or a discount department store like Kmart at the other end, and then limited access to make sure you walk past as many things as you can. They're often located away from public transport because the land was cheaper, and essentially an internalised design, so often with blank walls to the outside and internalised. So I've been going on about shopping centres somewhat unfashionably for some time, it's particularly odd because I don't like shopping at all myself. And but I think it's important because it's something everybody does, and it's also it has both social significance and economic importance, I think. If you ask people to describe the suburb they live in, what they'll often describe is their local shopping centre. Shopping centres are really the community spaces of our suburbs, and they contribute a sense of identity to the place, and as well as just being, of course, the place you go for food and goods and services, and sometimes for local employment. So if they all look exactly the same and they all have exactly the same thing, you're losing that opportunity, I think, for the community to have an identity that's a bit different from the next one. I think that Australian planners have not considered the importance of the form of retailing as much as they should have. Certainly in Europe, particularly in Britain, there's many more guidelines about retailing. They're far more concerned about preserving traditional town centres. The Brits have had a policy since the 70s about preventing the dispersal of shops, for example, and stopping the kind of big box highway-based retailing that we have all over the place. I'll talk very briefly about two of the bits of work I've done on this. Firstly, and this one goes back a few years, I wanted to look at what our planning policy said about the form of retailing and whether the planning policy's descriptions or prescriptions for retailing was actually having an effect on what we got. So the big strategic plan of the last 11 years in Melbourne has been Melbourne 2030. It's currently been put on the shelf, but we're still waiting for the next one. So we're in a kind of hiatus in between plans. It came out with a lot of general talk about activity centres, and a lot of the overall thrust of the plan was to identify the activity centres, being shopping centres with other things in them, like employment, and to try and congregate more housing and increase growth around the activity centres. That was basically the plan, and to stop Melbourne continuing to grow outwards by putting more housing around these centres. But about the actual, what the centres should be like, one of the controversial things was that the large shopping malls, the big ones like Chadstone, were actually named as activity centres in the policy, indicating that, in a sense, they were getting the blessing of the planning policy, saying these would be good places to put more developer around. Whereas earlier versions of policies had tried to stop them growing, these were actually encouraging them to grow more. But the guidelines that were released a few years later indicated there were 8 aims for good design of centres. These are guidelines, bear in mind. So to develop a good quality public environment, promote street-based patterns of connection, so this is a movement away from concrete walls, improve community safety through active street frontages, encourage mixed use, improve pedestrian and cycling amenity, promote public transport focus, increase accessibility and integration, and encourage environmental sustainability. All good common sense, who could argue? So the model basically being promoted was that centres should be based around public transport, accessible by car of course, but by other means with a mix of uses and good public spaces and with good building design and energy efficiency. They didn't come out and say they didn't like shopping malls, but I think if you read the economic criteria of contribute to economic competitiveness that provides wide community benefit and improve business and employment opportunities, it does suggest that multiple ownership is a better idea than corporate ownership. But, you know, that's my take on it. So what we looked at in this project was looked at the 17 centres that were either built or planned, and most of these were still in the planning stage, but we could see the plans after 2002, so after the policy had come out. What we found, of course, was that most of the centres fell well short of that picture that I just painted of what the guidelines suggested a good centre would be like. Very few of them were located near public transport. Now that's partly, the 17, I should say, was just new centres in the growth areas. I only looked at the growth areas, so the sort of greenfield suburbs that I'm talking about. Very few were located around public transport, partly because there isn't a lot of public transport in the outer suburbs, but even where there was, and that's why I've put up this one on the far southeast of Melbourne, even where there is a existing train line and they were putting a new station in. The new station's here, this is all the housing development, and they're putting the shopping centre up here because the retailers prefer to try and pick up passing trade that's coming down the highway. But it doesn't fit with what the guidelines suggested. And you know, there's a lot of people say, well, people don't go shopping by train, but as somebody that travels to and from work every day on the train, I love the fact that there's a supermarket in the train station, because you can pick up your ingredients for dinner on the way home. So it's integrating your shopping into the daily trips that you do. This is shorthand findings of my entire article about this, which we analysed the centres against all those criteria, and in a very careful way I explained it in lots of boring tables. The Grattan Institute picked this up last year, I think, and put it in one of their reports, and managed to get all my entire findings into one, albeit slightly tricky to read, graph, but I was impressed that they could do this. It'll take you 10 minutes to get the hang of what it's suggesting, but if you basically get the idea that the grey is bad and the dark brown is good, you'll get the basic idea that on the accessibility measures and the kind of promoting street activity, active street frontages, and the diversity of uses, they're not scoring very well. It does show that I need to improve my act, though, to get these sort of graphics into my papers. So, as I've said, there is a standard model for a shopping centre, and of course a lot of the people that build them are very large corporations, the Westfields and developers like that. Part of the project, I went and talked to planners in these areas about what thinking had gone into the retail provision and what their negotiations with the retail developers were like. And again, it's not that the planners hadn't thought all this through. I mean, they were quite aware of what it would be good to try and achieve, but it's very hard to negotiate with such large and powerful organisations who will give in on some issues quite easily when pushed, the things that they don't think are important, and were completely adamant on others. So the issue of trying to get the kind of street-based retailing and shops opening onto the street rather than a mall with a two or perhaps more entrance that people are forced to walk in, that was very difficult for people to negotiate with. And often they would only give in and put takeaway food on the outside, but not any other sort of shops. One planner told me about her negotiations, trying to stick to her guns about this, and being told by the retailer's representative that if she didn't want the shopping centre, it could easily go to the municipality next door, and perhaps he should talk to the mayor about it, whereupon she knew she'd lost. So very large corporations are hard to deal with, and it can be very hard to get some of these things done if there's not more general support and a bit more power in the plans at a higher level, I think. The form and location of retailing, of course, has a big impact on a whole lot of measures of sustainability of our cities, and particularly on travel patterns. Shopping malls, of course, are designed around the car. That's why they were invented, as I tried to show you with the pictures from the 54 plan. Walking in and out of them is often difficult, as everybody would know, because you have to walk through all the cars. We found, when we went and looked at some of the recent ones built, that they didn't appear to be very well integrated with their surrounding suburbs. These are some nice photos of what it's like to be a neighbour of these things. Again, you know, the guidelines suggesting they should be. And of course, the internalised artificial environment is very heavy on energy usage. There's been some improvement. Supermarkets are starting to close in their refrigeration, but often they have open fridges, which is incredibly energy inefficient. One of my basic points, though, is that the corporate control of the environment inhibits local business startups, as I said. It's not that, it's partly that they'll have a standard range of shops that they would like to see in their shopping centre, and they're very often chain stores. But it's also just that tenants have to comply with standard opening hours, which are often quite difficult for small businesses to come up with. And of course, you have to be basically a shop rather than some other form of business that might use a shop front. And of course, they all look very alike. So, as I was saying, one thing is that community identity can be expressed. You can see the nature of the local population much more in your strip shopping centre because of the ability to start up often cafes and restaurants, which we all like, but other sorts of businesses too. This is Melbourne's Footscray, where the African community is, and Richmond, one of the centres of the Vietnamese community. A more recent project that I've done on retail form, basically still following on this anti-shopping mall crusade of mine, was looking at comparison of Brisbane to Melbourne. It came about partly because a colleague of mine from Queensland was down in Melbourne and was just remarking on how much more traditional shopping strips we seem to have, and we started to wonder why. Why is it that Brisbane appears to have mostly shopping malls and not shopping streets? You can ask me that in the question time if you like. There's a Dorothy Dixer, but I don't really have time to go into that. What I'll show from that project is just the increase of them. And the increase of them is really largely because, as I say, that's all we're building now. So all the outward expansion is adding to the number of shopping malls. There's a lot of difficulty with the data, getting data on shopping malls. Up until 1991-92, the ABS used to do retail censuses every 5 years from the Second World War. It was just fantastic data because it was a census, so every retail premise in Australia was surveyed, and so there was employment data and turnover data and built form, all kinds of stuff, but it was obviously very expensive to run, and the last one was 91-92. Now there is a good source of data on corporate shopping malls, but not on street-based. So it's now just up to a local government. So some local governments will collect information, but a lot won't. So it's quite tricky to work out proportionally now. We did it assuming that street-based retailing basically hadn't increased and we could work out proportions. But here at least I'm showing you the number and percentage increase of corporate malls. They're all counted by the Property Council. And you can see that, interestingly, Brisbane and Melbourne have about the same number of corporate shopping malls, about 180 each, but Melbourne has twice the population. Brisbane had doubled their number in the period that we were looking at, and Melbourne had increased by 2/3. So I suppose one of the things I get out of that is that these places, that if you think of a shopping mall or a shopping centre as still part of the fabric of our community and part of the fabric of our suburb, what we're seeing is that they're being designed and built to the determinations of the private sector and to budgets rather than to any sense of strategic plans or strategic goals. Now, developers are simply doing what they do, which is run businesses and build things that sell and build low risk investment. But it's really up to planners in the planning process to insert the public good. As I showed you with the guidelines for the shopping centres, it's not that our strategic plans generally don't say good things about what planning should do. They're often very full of good intent and a good description of what the built form should look like. We now generally have aims for consolidation, most plans are about consolidation, increasing public transport, sustainability generally, social inclusion. So are our plans, she asks rhetorically, are our plans having the desired impact? So, I'll just get a sip of water. A recent project that we did in Melbourne was funded by AHURI, the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, which RMIT has a AHURI centre, and Sydney is soon to have an AHURI centre. AHURI funded the project to look at the effect that planning policy was having on housing outcomes. So again, the policy that we're looking, we looked at quite a lot of, we looked at both policy and the statutory system, the regulatory system, but what I'll talk about just here is the actual policy. So the policy concern that I'll be referring to is, again, our last metropolitan strategy, Melbourne 2030. And what we were asking was, did the planning policy achieve its own stated aim? So we're just comparing it to what it says it was trying to do. The way it was done was using two very large databases from the Valuer General's department on sales and property valuation, and these two were painstakingly merged and then put into mapping software, and I might add, not at all by me, but by very competent people who are good with quantitative work. But we also went around and interviewed planners and developers, which is, being more of a qualitative type, is something that I did. The long-standing policy in Melbourne has always been to allow outward growth, just in particular growth corridors. We have, it's called corridors and wedges, because if corridors go out, you end up with wedge shapes, sort of, in between. Reputedly, policy that was copying the Copenhagen finger plan in the post-war period, but this is disputed by some. So when we were looking at this, we divided the metropolitan region into inner, middle, outer non-growth areas and growth areas. But what I'll show you is mainly just the growth areas, because the theme of tonight's talk is new suburbs. So I'm hoping to just get the relevant bits. So 2030 was, as I said before, broadly aimed at urban consolidation, particularly around particular centres, activity centres and transport. But it did have an aim to increase residential densities. The average residential density across the Melbourne metropolitan area was about 9 lots per hectare, which is, as my colleague Michael Buxton often says, world's worst practice. It's very low density. The inner suburb of Melbourne would be more like 25 to 35, I guess. So it does vary a lot. It also, we wanted to increase, the policy wanted to increase the proportion of housing in existing areas and slowly pull back that outward expansion. And improve housing affordability by offering a greater range of housing types. That was one of the key things. And of course, locating a greater proportion of housing close to transport, close to employment and close to services. So the shaded bit is the area after 2030 came out, after 2002. You can't expect instant change because policies take time, things are in the pipeline. But we took this up to 2008. You would hope to see some effect. So the location of new housing increasingly in growth areas, when the policy was saying we were going to decrease the proportion of new housing in growth areas. The growth area, as you can see, is the dark line, and there is a trend up at the very end, but at the very least you could say that it's not decreasing. So we weren't having a lot of impact there. The policy also was suggesting we needed greater housing diversity. This is showing the housing type, just very roughly broken into detached houses and everything else, so medium density, townhouses, flats. Again, the policy doesn't appear to be having a lot of effect. You could say they look pretty much like two straight lines, don't they? 90% of all housing in the growth areas continued up until then. I don't know what's happened since 2008. Continue to be detached housing. House size by number of bedrooms. We did it by floor space and number of bedrooms. This one I'll just show you is all the new houses being built in the growth areas, number of bedrooms. The only real change that is happening is a swap between the 3 bedrooms and the 4+ bedrooms. So still very negligible amounts of small housing in those areas, but big houses getting bigger. Anecdotally, people say this trend has slowed down, that the enormous houses have stopped, but we don't have the data, the hard data. Floor size as a proportion of lot size. So really the only thing we found that was working according to plan was the actual lots were getting smaller. But as the houses were getting bigger, proportionally, the proportions were changing. So lot size was getting smaller, which you could say is a win for the planners, but it does look a little bit like that trend had started some time before and in fact was just continuing. And in interviews, that's what developers suggested. It was really just about the price of land, not about government policy. And new dwellings being built within 1 kilometre of an activity centre. If you had to do a trend line, you wouldn't say it was going up, would you? Sadly, it does look like it's a little bit like it might be going down a bit, but not having a big effect. So you have to ask, why did planning policy have so little effect? The interviews that we conducted suggested that the realities of the market and what were perceived to sell was what developers had in their minds, not government policy. But ultimately what we found was, of course, there was no reason for them to change. They were not being compelled to change. The language of the policy was advisory, not regulatory. I should have put the source of this picture. It is actually from the Age newspaper. I left the caption off the bottom, but it just shows you the size of some nice new houses. I'm using the word nice broadly. So what some of the developers told us was that the policy was just very hard for them to interpret. It was written in the kind of imprecise language that most of our policies are written in. I don't know if yours are exactly the same, using the same kind of language, but this is a quote from one developer who said they didn't take government planning policies into account because they're so vague. I mean, how could they ever influence anything you do? They're so general. He just couldn't work out what he was supposed to do with these general statements. So as nobody was telling him he did need to take notice of them, he just ignored them. It's really about the language and other things. This is something I often try and say to planning students, that you can write a beautiful aim and a fantastic picture of how you think the future should be, but you really need to do something to make it actually happen. And you know, good aspirations are obviously very important, and a good plan and a good vision and getting the community behind it is obviously very important. But if there's nothing compelling, nothing compulsory, and no sort of financial reasons to do it, no financial incentives, basically nothing's going to happen. So, despite those graphs I showed you, when we asked, do we need more planning if planning doesn't work, the answer is, of course, yes, we do. Better planning for new suburbs is critical. What I'm really saying, I think, at the end of everything is that we just must get better at focusing on the detail, paying more attention to what is, firstly, what is possible, why things are being built where they are, and what we can do to intervene. And there needs to be far less wishy-washy aspirational statements and more clear guidelines. Developers generally want clarity and a level playing field for everybody, which comes with more certainty. There is a kind of circular problem, which I've alluded to, about things in the outer suburbs, that a lot more services and amenities and fine grain will only happen really if it's seen that there are enough people out there to support a lot of those things. That's why a lot of neighbourhood shops have disappeared. You know, the milk bar doesn't exist a lot unless it's in the form of a servo with, or a 7-Eleven, because it's to do with the finances. But in order to get more densities, as I've suggested, people need to have the trade-offs of the public goods and amenities around there, or they're not going to be prepared to be living closer together and have smaller dwellings. So that's about it. I'll leave you with that thought that I think in the end it's all about detail, and we need to pay more attention, particularly in retail planning, and not just leave it up to the market. And with master plan estates, not leave the internal planning up to the developers. And I'll just put up some of those references if anybody's interested to look at them. Thank you.